Good evening, social media. We're going to get started here with a great program this evening for you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my sound. We'll play some music and let everybody in. Here we go. Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club. This is Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, September 5th. It's great to see you all this evening. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the VBC. And this is, I think, the first Thursday that I've been co-host for a little while, so it's nice to be back. Nice to see all of you again. No, last week we had our wonderful VBC Jeopardy! World War II Jeopardy, which was a great time, and we had a lot of wonderful guests last week as well. A lot of great facts and history. This week we have a wonderful program for you. Glenn is going to be hosting, and for those of you who may be joining us new to the VBC, our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories, to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. And we're going to be doing a lot of that tonight with our guest, which Glenn, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'll let you introduce our wonderful guest for the evening.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. It's been a few weeks since I've done a Greatest Generation Live, other than the World War II Jeopardy, which really was done by Todd and some of our great members who are so good at that. So it's a pleasure to be back, kind of really starting the fall season, if you will. And we've got a great lineup of programs come this fall. We are going to be taking a bit of a break because I will be in England for the next 3 weeks, 10 days of that with our travel group. So I will be missing in action, if so to speak. But starting October 3rd, will be every Thursday night for the rest of the year, other than a couple of holidays. So tonight, let me introduce our guest, Heather Shreve. Heather, please say hello.
Hello, everyone. Good evening.
We're really pleased to have Heather on. Heather is an award-winning screenwriter, historian, story designer, master artist for producer-ready film projects that she's and about to release her 7th book this fall. This is her first novel that will be released, called Blue Star Trilogy, that is all about her family and service. And her family has a long military service record for our country. Heather herself is a child of an Army veteran, and her family have served in almost unbroken succession in the U.S. Army since 1775. Ben, that's even older than you, Ben. She has a long, incredible family background. I should have asked, by the way, do we have any of our World War II veterans with us tonight? Ed, are you on the program?
I do see Ed. I just asked him to unmute.
I'm here.
Go, Ed.
Hi, Ed.
Hi. I'm looking forward to hearing your story.
I think most everybody on knows Ed. He's been on so many of our programs. He's become a very loyal listener. He's P-47 pilot, 65 missions in World War II, and he's coming with us to England in about 10 days' time to revisit every pub in England that he ever visited in 1954.
Wow.
Talk about a veteran, right, Ed?
You're right.
Now, we're looking forward to taking Ed with us and seeing some great sights. So thank you, Ed, for being on. I don't think I see any of the others on this evening that occasionally drop in. So let's get started with Heather. Heather, you are the granddaughter of Colonel Shreve, here's the book, The Colonel's Way, Secret Diaries of a POW in the Philippines, 1941 to 1945. Obviously, I've read this book. I highly recommend it. It's a book of incredible courage, incredible bravery, incredible suffering. I told Heather, I read a lot, as many of you know, and oftentimes I'd take a book like this and read it in a weekend. This took me like a month to read because every 10 or 15 pages, I had to take a break because of the, suffering that Colonel Shreve went through, and of course, all the other men that were prisoners of war in the Philippines. So it's just an incredible book, and the ending of it has a real life interesting twist to it, which we'll get into as Heather talks about this, which she's done many, many times. So Heather, let me start with your background a little more in depth than we had here, and how did you get to the point that you wanted to put his diaries together and provide the historical context that you do in the book?
Right. So back in the early 2000s, probably around 04, 05, I was just about to get divorced, and the only living person at the time, my uncle Doug, gave me, which is my father's brother, gave me the actual original war transcriptions of his diaries that the War Department Bill actually did it in San Francisco, transcribed it from his hidden diaries into a document and gave it to me. And, just like you, I was like, this is probably going to be a tough read. So I set it aside for 10 years. But in 2014, I pulled it out and read the whole thing. And of course, after reading it, I was like, holy mackerel, people need to hear this story. And not only is it a blow by blow of the ball of baton from a guy on the ground who was chief of artillery for the Second Corps, but it's an amazing triumph story. Like, it starts off, you're thinking, well, this is going to be dicey, but no. And as you read, there's not one word of pity in his writing.
Right.
Ever.
And just the point,
it's one day after another. I lost audio there for a minute.
Yeah, you came back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if it's my connect, but I'm having trouble hearing you guys.
So let me ask.
Anyway, so every day was just a new.
I think we were in a bit of an audio hiccup. Heather, we seem to have gotten you back. If it hiccups like that, we'll just let it sort of iron itself out. But we should be good now.
Okay, yeah. So basically, he just was, he was just the problem solver every day. Rubber meets the road. He got up and tried to solve the next problem and the next crisis, right? Every day for 1,000 days. So it's an incredible story. But, of course, it starts a little bit before that. He served in 4 wars. So he joined in 1917 in April when we went to, when the Americans joined the Great War, and he signed up at the Maryland National Guard. Okay, we're good. Signed up for the Maryland National Guard and quickly transferred to the Aviation Section Signal Corps so he could fly. He ended up getting his wings from the University of Illinois at the end of 1917. And then they sent him through a whole bunch of other machine gun schools, Wilbur Wright Field, and all these different places. And then they sent him off to Issoudun, France, where he received another 70 or 80 hours in combat training, pursuit pilot training. But then they sent him to the middle of France in Romorantin, where they were assembling DH-4 de Havillands around the clock. And in the end, he was not a combat pilot. They used him as a ferry pilot. And for the last 8 or 9 weeks of war, he ferried DH-4 de Havillands to the Western Front until the very end, through the Meuse-Argonne push and everything. So that was his job. Of course, back then, no promises and no parachutes. The average life of a pilot was only about 50 hours. So he was able to get through all of any flak. I don't know how he did that, but he made it back.
Yeah.
He made it back. So he came back in February 1919 and actually went back to work for a while. But you know, he had this thing in him. He had to serve, so he quit his job, re-enlisted at the end of 1919, early 1920 as a first lieutenant, and yeah. So we're going a little bit too fast there, Glenn.
Sorry, I'll back up. I'll back up one here.
That's okay. That's okay. That's right. So one of the first, this is training in World War One, like you're correct. And then his first assignment was, he went to Camp Funston for a while to train, and then they sent him to Oahu. They sent him to Schofield Barracks for 4.5 years. The good thing that happened there was he learned about Pacific defense and island defense and the Japanese. Secondly, a famous general from World War I asked him to be his aide, which was Joseph Kuhn, who was in the Meuse-Argonne Push as well. And he was his aide for 3.5 years. And Kuhn traveled around the Western coast, so he took him up to Vancouver Barracks for the 100th anniversary. He was there for that. They went to the Presidio for one of the first CMTCs, which is a civilian military training camps. Here they are. At the Presidio, 1924. Arthur was there building men and helping train these little newbies here. And he got a lot of experience with Kuhn, following him around here and there. And actually, I thought I had a picture of Blackjack Pershing, because Blackjack Pershing visited this camp in 1924 in September before he retired. But I don't think it's him, Glenn. You saw the picture I sent you. I don't think it's him, is it?
I didn't study it that close, but yeah.
Oh, okay. But but anyway, got a lot of great photographs from that era. Yeah. So after the 4 years in Hawaii, they sent him to Fort Benjamin Harrison. Oh, before that, he got married to Julia, who he met in Honolulu, in the biggest military wedding in Dayton, Ohio history. Was like 250 people in 1926. And then they moved to Fort Benjamin Harrison, and went to Fort Sill, back to Harrison, and then blah, blah, blah. You know, my grandfather was there for the Dust Bowl, the Depression, the crash, and he was part of one of the first big CCCs at Fort Knox in 1933. He billeted thousands of men. And then, we're not that far yet. Yes, he joined the arm jumping and polo team in Hawaii, and he was on it off and on for about 20 years. He was an excellent equestrian. And in 1932, I'm writing about it now in the novel called The Long Blue Shadow. In 1932, ordered 44 horses from Fort Riley, a U.S. Army office, and it was an amazing game. So oh no, the internet. Yeah.
If I could just make this comment, you know, I mean, he really, as you'll hear here in a little bit, once we start the story of him in the Philippines and the Bataan Death March, and then his survival through as a POW, he's sort of building the character, the integrity, the person that comes out so vividly in the diaries during this interwar period. It's like he's in training for what's going to happen to him, even though
I know it's true. It's so weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I tell you a quick little anecdotal story about that? So I have an original letter from 1920, July 1st, because Arthur worked for several companies before he, you know, in the interim time, he went back to see what is it? Whiting Turner, the big construction company. I have a letter from G.W. Whiting himself saying he's so sad to let Arthur go back to the Army because he was so good with large numbers of men.
Yeah. A leader. I mean, he really demonstrated and learned that leadership for the 20 years prior to what happens to him in the Philippines.
Right. So anyway, 32, 33, whatever, he's working at these CCCs here and there, Fort Knox, whatever. And then he becomes part of the first mechanized artillery in history in 1935 and 6. at Fort Knox. And I have a silver cup with his name on it. He was part of Battery A, first commander of Battery A at Fort Knox with this mechanized artillery, whatever. They had to finally get rid of horses, I guess. So, 37, 38, he's thinking of winding down maybe, or at least moving east. So they send Bill to find a house in Howard County so they could settle in the east. And the next thing they know, they get this telegram from Bill that says, found a farm, loved it so much, bought it myself. And Julia goes, God damn it, Arthur, the next farm we find, it's going to be our decision. So they find a farm in Howard County, not far from Bill, and call it Our Decision. And they moved there in 1938. In 1940, General William Ritchie, who's Air Force fame already, he's quite a famous guy already, throws Arthur a 20-year party at Fort Leavenworth. And it's a big deal. Like, I've got the invitation. They invited, I don't know how many people to this 20-year party. Arthur never really thinks of retiring at 20 years, by the way. And he ends up working at Fort DuPont with Bill for coastal artillery there for a couple of years. And then, of course, in August of 1941, he gets a letter from the War Department saying that they need him in the Philippines. Now, I know you guys know this, but I'll just say it anyway. At that moment, there was so few officers. They needed every single officer they had in the Philippines because everybody else was in Europe by that time. So Arthur, all of Arthur's friends, all his West Point friends, Babcock, Hurt, Marshall Hurt, Ed Williams, like all the guys he knew at, the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, all his friends ended up in the Philippines. So he gets on a steamer. He gets to the Philippines November 28th, whatever, 1941. Oh, by the way, he leaves the house October 25th, 1941. So just remember that, October 25th. So he gets to the Philippines. He's at the Army Navy Club. They're thinking, it's kind of a cherry job so far, right? And then the next thing you know, he gets a note from George. By the way, so he gets there as a quartermaster. That's his job. He thinks that's going to be his job. General Parker, who's in charge of the South Luzon Force, puts him in charge. He gives him chief of artillery at the same time. So he's got two jobs. So the next thing you know, he gets this letter from Parker that the hull notes, nobody's responded to the hull note, and that there's planes and ships coming from the Sea of Siam or whatever, headed their way. So that's, so Arthur gets a call from 00 Wilson on December, early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, that Pearl Harbor's been hit. And he's at headquarters there in Manila. So anyway, and then of course they know they're going to be next. And of course they get attacked by air at first. Clark Field, all the, different airfields get attacked. And about this time, Arthur's been surveying the island, which has got, 15,000 miles of open coast to defend. It's a small little thing. So he's in southern parts of Bataan here on the east and the west. And I think it's December 24th, the Japanese attack from the Linganing Gulf side, which is the northwest corner of Luzon. Pretty big attack. It's Fort Luzon. Arthur, being the artillery. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to try to show with my
pointer,
but the pointer is really giving me some problems here, so I can't do it as to where the Japanese first landed. I'm not sure why, but anyway, go. Yeah.
Okay, just so you know, you're in and out, so if I miss something, just interrupt me. So he's surveying the island. He goes down to the southeast corner because he about the Japanese mousetrap tactics. And he goes to well, he goes to King, he goes to MacArthur and requests more artillery for Antimon and Lamont Bay because he thinks they're going to attack there. And he requests more artillery, and they're like, we don't have it because we're putting this thing together on a shoestring, right? So they don't have any artillery to spare. So Arthur, on the coast of Antimon, puts one of his reconnaissance officers, Lightfoot, his name is Major Lightfoot, to watch that location. So in the wee hour, I'm sorry, it was the 21st that they attacked Lincoln. 24th of December, 1941, Arthur goes to check that position, and he runs into this little hotel where Lightfoot's sleeping and wakes him up. And the Filipino woman who's in charge of this hotel goes, look, and they go to the window, and around Alabat Island, they see the entire 16th Division of the Japanese coming out behind this island, headed for shore unopposed. So that's what begins the fall of Bataan, was that second attack, the one that Arthur predicted.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So anyway, so after that, the fall of Bataan begins, and it's a mess. Arthur does get a field upgrade to full bird colonel for that prediction. And Parker writes him a letter and signs it and whatever. And so there's that. And then, things are a little bit in disarray.
If I could
for the next couple of, please
make a comment. First of all, Sean, is there anything we can do about Heather's voice fading in and out?
Heather, it's the only best way to do it is just to stay as close to your mic as you can. But if you're having internet issues, that's just going to dip a little bit here and there.
Well, and right now I can't, without getting out of here, I can't see my internet connection bars. So, you know what I'm saying? Like I can't really see.
Okay. Yeah, if you have any other programs open on a computer, that Colin says in the chat, that might help. But otherwise, I've been listening throughout, and you've only dipped out or slowed down a little bit a couple times. So I say we keep going.
Okay, or I could. How can I minimize this page so I can close some programs? Maybe.
Are you on a Mac or PC?
I'm on a PC.
PC. You should be on the top left. There might be or the top right there. There might be like 3 icons. Don't hit the X because you don't want to X out of Zoom. There might be a little button. Might be a little button with an underline, and the underline might
no, we'll see
minimize.
that. Darn it.
That's all right.
I see no minimize button.
That's all right.
Anyway,
what I wanted to comment on, Heather, is the first third of his diaries or so are all about the fall of Bataan and the fall of the Philippines first, of course, and the fall of Bataan, and eventually the surrender. And what impressed me about his writing here, his writing is so clear and easy to read, but the chaos around him is what I was actually disturbed by, because I guess I shouldn't have been disturbed. I shouldn't have been thought any differently, because this was a huge debacle on the part of the U.S. Army and its Supreme Commander Douglas MacArthur. But
we're getting to that. Yeah, we're going to get to that in a minute.
It just seemed that day to day, he and his fellow officers, were told turn right one day, then the next day turn left, then retreat 100 yards and turn around in a circle and go a different direction. It was absolute chaos.
It was chaos. Yeah. So I'll try to speed this up real quick. So in February, he has an attack of appendicitis, and he's in a field hospital being operated on. And after he recovers from that, March 10th, MacArthur leaves the island, right? And I have to look at my notes here for a second. MacArthur leaves the island. And so General Wainwright is then promoted to Lieutenant General of not just the South Luzon Force, but the entire U.S. forces. Okay. Because Arthur he was basically laid up for a month, And when he got out of the hospital on March 21st, he became part of the command general staff under Wainwright, okay, with King. So I wanted to get that right. So he was now in command general staff, which is important later. So at this time, he's working under King, and because he's still quartermaster, he's coordinating gas and food to run out at the same time, which he predicts is April 15th. So as you know, April 9th, they end up surrendering because, like you said, it's a mess. And he's pretty close to that prediction. Because he's on command general staff, he does not have to walk the Death March. He is driven in a staff car to O'Donnell, which takes him about a day. And if you remember in the diaries, I mean, there's a couple of times where they force him out of the car, search him, and tell him to run into the jungle. But he won't do it. He won't abandon his men. So anyway, he gets to O'Donnell, and it's just a burned out Filipino camp, right? And there's
Okay. I finally have this
one spigot for what will be 65 Filipino Seoul American POWs, so 75,000 men, and there's only one spigot of water running. So Arthur gets the Army Corps of Engineers, and he gets them to fix the other spigots, so there's more water. And then he goes to King, and of course the Geneva Convention rules say no officer can work under these conditions. And Arthur's like, well, forget that. He just threw the book away on that. And he asked King if he can billet and triage all 75,000 death marchers. And he says, Colonel, and this is the direct quote, he says, Colonel, you got the job. So Arthur stands there for 2.5 weeks and greets every single death marcher, puts them in the hospital, gets them water, food, sends them off to their barracks, whatever it is that they need to have done, he does it for 2.5 weeks. So after that, they eventually, after they get there, you know, people are dying left and right at this point. And as a matter of fact, the first wave of people that die are all 24 and under. And that's a trend that continues because a lot of those men don't have wives, children, or anyone to go home to. So the lack of purpose is, you know, that gets to them a little bit. So the older officers are the ones that actually do way better, which is interesting. Anyway, then they move them to Cabanatuan in June of that year, June, July-ish. And the Japanese insist that the Americans command their own POWs. I mean, command the POW. So Arthur set up next to the Japanese headquarters in the American headquarters as third in charge. So it's Beecher, who's a Marine, and I forget the executive, and then there's Arthur, who's the other executive. I forget the, and then so there's like and on staff. One of the only jobs outside of camp, which is cutting wood in the Sierra Madres mountains for the kitchens. And of course, Arthur thinking ahead how he's going to get out and maybe to cut wood with Joe Ganau, one of his friends. So he's out in the Sierra Madres mountains cutting wood. And I'm pretty sure this is where he's able to make exchanges with the Filipino resistance out in the mountains there. Anyway, long story short, so, you know, people are dying, you know, he's helping bury them. Things aren't going very well. But somewhere around August, there's this letter that gets into camp through the
We're getting a bit of hiccups, Heather.
Colonel Engelhard, who's the interpreter.
You'll catch up to us in a sec.
And basically, okay,
yep, we'll pause for just a sec so your internet can catch up.
Catch up. Okay.
Yeah, just a sec.
Sean,
Yes.
would it help if Heather disconnected and connected? Could that be?
I could try to put her in the waiting room and bring her back in. We had a good run there, and then it
okay.
got choppy on us. All I'll do is I'll move you into the waiting room and I'll bring you right back into the room, and that might help. Give us one sec.
Okay.
So Glenn, you were having a rough time getting through the book simply because of the
Yeah,
difficult.
once they get to Cabanatuan, if I pronounce that correct, you know, every entry is, you know, laced with how little food they had to eat, how many men were in the hospital, how many men they lost that week, that month,
Mhm.
how many beatings took place, if any of the officers or men, you know, disobeyed the Japanese, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just, you know, more suffering than I could stand to listen to read at, you know, more than for half an hour at a time. So
It makes you think about how someone was able to get through that and come out of the other side and still be a functioning, you know, a
yes,
functioning adult.
well, and you'll see of the very few men who make it back, all of them have issues.
No doubt.
Maybe not 100%, but I can't believe anybody did not have issues.
I see Heather is
Marilyn,
back in the room.
I see Marilyn Walton on our feed tonight. Marilyn, hello. If we could unmute her, I'll ask her to unmute while we're waiting for Heather to catch up here.
It won't unmute. Mute. Let's see here. Let's see if I can ask you to unmute, Heather. I see Heather's screen. Let's see if.
Oh, I'm unmuted.
There you are.
Here I am.
I asked Marilyn to come on. Most of you know Marilyn Walton from our programs earlier this year on the.
There we go. I'm back. Oh, thank goodness.
Oh.
Yes, it wouldn't let me unmute or anything. I don't know what that was about. Anyway.
So
Hold on
yeah,
one sec.
Heather,
So
I was just
go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, I was just introducing Marilyn Walton while we were waiting for you. Marilyn is our POW expert on the German prison or the American prisoners of war in the Stalag Luft camps.
Okay.
Mostly 8th Air Force men. And we
Yeah.
must have done half a dozen programs related to that.
This is the other side of it now, the Pacific. I'm not as well versed in that, of course. I was curious when she talked about the hunger there. Our prisoners over there had Red Cross parcels. Did they not have anything from the Red Cross in the Pacific camps? I don't.
So,
Yeah.
so it took a year to get in the letters from the Red Cross and then some parcels, but it was very spotty. Okay.
It's too bad.
So, yeah. So anyway, so
Curious.
anyway, so where did I leave off? We're talking about, oh, so in August, they get this letter through the Filipino underground and Colonel Engelhart receives it. So they're all privy to this. Now they've got a channel to get things out of camp. What they're looking for from Washington is intelligence, you know, how many people in camp have died, how many Japanese, whatever. But Arthur's like, he insists they use it for humanitarian purposes. So he ends up getting a message through the Filipino underground back to Howard County, Maryland, to Julia or Bill, I'm not sure. And they send him his Howard County bank checkbook back to Cabanatuan, and they get it through. And Arthur starts writing checks in the underground at 50% commission for food and everything. So he can save Johnny. I was telling Sean before. He's 29. He's a lieutenant colonel. What?
It slowed down just a touch on us again. I apologize. Yeah. So I apologize to Heather and everybody here. Just technical difficulties happen, but we're doing the best we can. So please continue on, Heather. Once it hiccups, I just like to stop you a minute so that we can sort of have you catch up.
So I looked at my Wi-Fi when we had a break, and I have all 6 bars on my Wi-Fi, so I don't know. Anyway,
yeah. Sometimes we're dealing with the satellites. They're
I don't know
connecting all of us.
So,
but
anyway,
thank you for your patience.
That's no problem at all. So he starts writing checks, whatever. I don't know how we will never know because Bill is gone. Everybody's gone. We don't know the story. Bill's records burned in the Nara fire. And of course, this was all secret at the time, so there's no record of it, except I have declassified documents from NSA, the Army, and CIA with all the players in this. Anyway, so this goes on for a while. You know, Arthur's writing checks, doing whatever he can. And, you know, they're losing a lot of men. Again, the officers like Colonel North, who's a doctor, Jack Schwartz, who's a doctor, and a lot of the older officers, King, Ed Williams, they're all doing pretty well because they're older, ironically. But Arthur, you know, talking about what Glenn was saying earlier, Arthur, for a matter of record, and so it would go down in history, he did two things. One is he kept secret diaries of everything and buried them in Cabanatuan, of all the Geneva Convention violations. He protested the Japanese at great personal risk, almost on a daily basis on their treatment. At any moment, they could have lopped his head off. So at great personal risk, he was constantly doing that. Somewhere in late 42, he also, probably with Colonel North's medical tools or whatever, took the bottom half of his Army canteen off and created a crystal radio receiver and put it back in his canteen. So the top half held water and the bottom half was a crystal radio receiver. So he could start listening in to whatever he could pick up. At this same time, Bill Shreve, his brother, leveraged probably General Ritchie, who was head of the USAF at the time in Washington, to get to the South Pacific Islands and the Solomon Islands. And he was following the Mosquito Radio Network. You have pictures of that, Glenn. You could show those now. The Mosquito Radio Network, there he is, all the way up to Guadalcanal. And there is no question that Bill Shreve, with that crystal radio or whatever, they were in contact, because towards the end of the war, he got a message to Bill on and a map on where the diaries were buried. Anyway, back to Cabanatuan. So Bill's over there listening, sending messages probably. So towards the end of 44, October. I'm sorry, I totally forgot.
We got a little slow down again here, Heather.
So, yes, so we're doing good. Okay, so
we'll let our internet catch up. I don't know if you froze, Heather. Seems like Heather. Oh,
are we good?
It seems like you're back.
I can hear you guys.
Yep, go ahead.
I can hear you. Okay, I can hear you guys.
Yeah.
So October of 44, the Japanese know the jig is up. You know, the US are bearing down here and there. They're flying over Cabanatuan. So Arthur, at this point, I think it's around October, I don't know, 14th-ish. There's only 1,600 American POWs left, including Arthur, down from 12,000. So Arthur and Beecher are the senior officers, and the Japanese pack them up and send them to Bilibid prison in Manila, which you have a picture of that too, Glenn.
Yep, I'll put it up.
For a short time, they were there.
Are you seeing the picture?
Yes, that's Bilibid prison.
Oh,
Yes.
it is. I can't see it, but can you guys see it?
Yes.
There it is. Okay. Boy, I don't know what's going on with the internet. Jeez Louise. Anyway, there it is. So they're there for a little while, maybe 6 weeks or so. And then around, let's see, I think it's December 14th. I'll look at my notes here. Yeah, December 13th, they put them on one of these Japanese hell ships, which is a transport ship. And Beecher's sick. So Arthur's now senior officer of these last 1,600 POWs. So they're squished in the baggage holds of these ships, and there's 500 men squished in these baggage holds, and it's just a horrendous situation. I won't even describe it. It's just horrible. So they get underway out to sea in Subic Bay. And the next thing you know, the U.S. Navy is bombing them, not realizing there's American POWs on board. So they're strafing the ship. One of the guns falls into the bay. It's a terrible situation. For the first time ever, Arthur starts to fade. And Colonel North, one of the medics, gives him one of his last morphine shots to try to save his life, because they're sweating and they're underfed and the whole 9 yards. So it saves his life. But the next day, it's December 15th now, the Japanese say abandon ship because the ship's on fire and it's been shot to hell. Oh, by the way, Arthur gets a bullet down the back of his neck from one of the planes, goes down his shirt collar and out his shirt tail. And he's fine, as he's helping Colonel North separate the living from the dead when they first get hit. So the Japanese tell them to abandon ship because the ship's sinking. So Arthur ties his shoes around his neck and does all this other stuff. He gets up to the top deck and he holds his nose and jumps 5 stories to the water below. 5 stories. He says in his diaries that the impact was so great that it ripped his pistol belt and his canteen from his person. So anyway, he comes to the surface, he swims to shore, which is about a third of a mile away. He turns around, stands in the water, and sees that there's men still on board. So he takes a piece of hatch cover, he says in his diaries, and paddles Hawaiian style back to the ship where the Japanese are pushing, shooting, just pushing men off the deck because they won't jump. So Arthur puts as many men as he can on this little piece of hatch cover and swims back to shore. So everybody gets to shore that's going to make it, and they watch this ship sink. And the Japanese take the last now 1,300 men and put them on the Subic Bay tennis court for the next 5 or 6 days in the broiling heat with only one spigot for water. It's so dire that Colonel Jack Schwartz, who's a medic, is amputating a Marine's arm with a razor blade. So anyway, Arthur insists, because Beecher's really sick still, and he's got dysentery or something, so Arthur's still in command. He goes to the Japanese, and he insists that they get better clothing, better food, better water, and he's advocating for them all the time. And they actually do listen to him. They get him some clothes. So then they march him to San Fernando and the train station there. And Christmas night, they put 198 men into train cars that are only meant for 80 men to take them to the next hell ship. The only reason they can breathe is because the U.S. Navy has put bullet holes in the roof of this train car. And the sickest POWs, the Japanese strap to the top of the train. So anyway, they get to the next hell ship, which is the Inora Maru, and they get underway. And I think I think they're now in the northern part of Luzon, so they're underway in Linganing Gulf. So they get underway in Linganing Gulf. I got to look at my dates here. Hold on. That is, yeah, so he's on the Inora Maru on the 27th December. On the 9th of January, the U.S. Navy torpedoes the ship, because they don't know there's POWs on board. So the ship, according to what Arthur says, just rips apart. The steel shell is just ripped into shrapnel. Arthur's sitting up against a hold. His best friend, David Babcock's on his right, and a Lieutenant Roberts is on his left. And when this ship gets hit by a torpedo and turns into shards of shrapnel, Babcock gets a piece of ship hull in his chest, and Roberts is decapitated. Arthur, he's fine. So he pulls the ship piece out of his friend's chest, and he helps the medics again separate the living from the dead. And this time they don't have to swim to shore. They get rescued on another boat and taken back to shore. And then they're put on a third hell ship mid-January, the Brazil Maru. Unfortunately, Babcock's not doing very well with this gaping chest wound from the shrapnel. And they're out to sea in the Sea of Formosa, and it's snowing because they're heading towards Japan. And in a very touching story, on January 24th, 1945, Johnny Johnson. So they're all on a ship, and it's cold, and they're forced to sleep on a steel deck. And the Japanese have issued one grass mat for every 4 men to try to keep warm. On the 24th of January, Johnny Johnson goes to the guards and trades his West Point ring for one more mat to try to help keep Babcock warm. Unfortunately, and according to my grandfather, Babcock dies that night, and there's nothing they can do for him. But, this whole time, Johnny and Arthur's still writing checks. I don't know how. And they're still trying to get medicine for people like Marshall Hurt and David Babcock. And we'll never know that part of the story. So anyway, they actually do get to Japan, and they're greeted finally by some real food, some British and Canadian officers who give them a long coat. They give them Red Cross food, and they take them to Camp 1 in Fukuoka, Japan, where my grandfather is doing, I don't want to say hard labor, but he's working with glasses from the deceased and scrubbing floors with bricks. At this point, he weighs only 96 pounds, but he's still going strong. There's a point at Fukuoka before he's transferred to Jinsen, Korea, and he goes to Jinsen, Korea, April 30th, 1945. Colonel North, the medics who are still alive, says to Arthur in the diaries, he said, "You know what? There is no medical reason, Arthur, why you should still be alive." And it's all because Arthur wants to get back to Julia and his 2 boys. And while he's been away on the farm, Julia and the boys have been putting fireflies in jars every summer for 4 years and putting them out on the fence posts at the entrance just in case their dad comes home. So it's a very touching story, and it's true. So anyway, Arthur is rescued from Jinsen, Korea, September 7th, 1945, and Bill is already keyed into this. He's already writing telegrams to Jinsen saying, when are they going to come get him? So, anyway,
Heather, may I interrupt?
Sure.
Sorry, so there's Susan put into the chat the years 42 to 44, but also she may have missed. She said, what were the checks for?
Oh, the checks were for food, medicine. For the men in camp. Mm-hmm. He was just trying to subsidize their crummy diet.
And to me, this is one of the key points of this story, and how Colonel Shreve saved himself and so many hundreds, if not thousands, of other men. So yes. Let me repeat this, because I had a hard time getting my head around this. And I've talked to Heather a couple of times about this. And I'm a former banker, so that's even worse. I understand check.
Numbers, yeah.
Started out in a branch 100 years ago, right after the Civil War.
Stop it.
The man had his checkbook sent to him from his bank in Maryland, okay? And he writes a check in US dollars for whatever amount, $500.
Right.
And he gives it to a Filipino
point person, underground person, some resistant person. Yes.
Resistant person. That guy takes a 50% cut, but takes it to a bank in Manila.
I guess, yes. Mm-hmm.
And somehow or another, this is unbelievable to me, but it happened. There's no doubt it happened. It's in his book many, many times. I don't know how many checks he cashed, but it seemed like dozens. Somehow or another, then that Filipino resistant guy brought him back Filipino dollars, which he then used on the...
Well, here's actually... Oh, go ahead.
Which he then used to buy food and medicine on the black market through the Filipino black marketeers, with the involvement at times, help me if I'm wrong here, Heather, with the involvement at times of the Japanese guards. Is that
No Japanese guards.
No Japanese
No,
guards.
the only thing that they could do with the Japanese guards is prime them with cigarettes so they would turn their head.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
But to your point, I think it was more simplistic than that. I think he cashed the check, but he already had given instructions to Fred Threat, who was the truck driver, the Japanese. He worked for the Japanese, but they didn't know that he was working for, the Americans. They already knew what food to get from Cabanatuan in the village and bring it back. I don't think they brought him back the cash. I think he already.
Okay. Okay.
Heather seems to have frozen up here. We'll let her catch
had
up.
the order put in for food.
There we go.
Yeah, you froze for a few seconds there, Heather. Heather, let me bring into the conversation Colin Heaton. Colin, I unmuted you. Are you unmuted still?
I think I'm good to go.
Yeah. Colin is a longtime friend of, he's an historian, a book writer, a man about town in the Carolinas, as I'm told. Now, Colin's a great friend of the VBC. He's been on many of our programs. And in the chat, he mentioned that he knows something about these hell ships. Colin, what's your knowledge of these hell ships?
Yeah, it was crazy. I interviewed a few guys who survived on the hell ships after the war. And so I have a YouTube channel, Forgotten History, and we've got about 600 videos, all of them, most of them military related, but everything dealing with crazy controversial stuff. But the hell ships most people don't realize that the hell ships were legitimate targets under the Geneva Convention of 1929 because they were not marked, which they should have been.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right.
If Japan had signed the convention, they would have been obligated to mark those ships with red crosses, or at least indicate with some marking that it was a prisoner of war transport, but they never did. And most of the deaths that occurred at sea with these prisoners were because the hell ships were torpedoed. And understand that the United States Navy submarine force was only 3% of the Navy, but they sank 90% of the Japanese merchant fleet. And these were merchantmen that were legitimate targets, and that's what they were going for.
Yeah, I knew that. I knew they were unmarked, and that's why they didn't know. I mean, they bombed them not knowing.
And the conditions on these hell ships, Heather didn't go into it in detail because it is so horrific. But again, that's part of this book. I think I was down to reading maybe 2 or 3 pages at a time when the colonel describes the conditions that these men were under in the hell ships.
And I've read Jack Schwartz's testimony. He was on the ship with Arthur and Colonel North, and I mean, he's a doctor, so he even goes into more detail. I'll just tell you one thing. On that first night on the Iraiku Morrow, there was, I don't want to say rumor because it did happen, but men were biting each other for each other's blood to get some kind of moisture.
That's true.
Yeah.
See someone with their hand up.
Yes.
A question.
Paula Kensinger.
Yeah, I'm not Paula. I apologize. I'm not Paula. You may be disappointed. I'm listening to all this. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a former Air Force ER medic. The trauma. I do extensive research on combat trauma. I have no idea how anybody could come back psychologically and socially after this horrific. I feel traumatized. And I've seen trauma in the emergency room. It's incredible. I don't understand how anybody could come back and have anywhere near a normal life.
But you know what's crazy about that, Paul? I mean, I know your name's not Paula, but Arthur.
What's your name, sir?
Yeah, what is
Richard.
your name? Sir?
Richard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Richard, to my knowledge, and everything that I've heard that's family lore has turned out to be true, so I'm pretty solid on this. he never had a PTSD moment or any trauma at all. But this guy had a mental strength that was superhuman. You already see that from listening to the story. I mean, he was like, you just couldn't, I mean, he was the unkillable soldier, really.
I've talked to a lot of veterans of Korea and Vietnam and the Middle East. Nobody is that strong. Trust me. God bless if he is. But an officer takes responsibility for all the people under him who died.
That's right.
So it just does not make sense to me.
Well, here's the thing, Richard. I think what kept him going is his responsibility to his men.
Okay.
And I think he knew deep down, because he was very conscious of how this was going to go down in history, right? Hence the diaries. I think that he knew.
Oh, Heather, you froze again. So sorry, everyone.
Beyond a shadow of a doubt, he did everything humanly possible for these men. Did everybody hear that?
Yes.
That he did everything humanly possible for his men, and his men kept him going.
Yeah. Anyway, so Bill went back in May of 45, they were buried in tin cans, wrapped in newspaper, got all 4 diaries out, back to the War Department in San Francisco.
Just a second, just to explain to the audience, because it's hard to follow. Bill, his brother, who had been in touch with him through this mosquito network, where does he go to find the diaries?
So he goes back to Manila in May of 45 when everybody's cleared out. Oh, by the way, Arthur even leaves a $500 check, or a check, $400, for the 500 left behind in Cabanatuan that the Army Rangers go back in, that the famous story of the Army Rangers, the Great Raid. Yeah. He leaves a check for those guys.
Yeah. And
Colin, you had a question?
Wait, to finish the story.
Okay,
Bill,
sorry, we'll do that.
How does Bill find the diaries?
So Arthur has gotten Bill somehow through their communication a map. Okay, so he knows where the diaries are buried. So he goes back in Cabanatuan, gets them unburies them. And in the movie, I have to make this up, okay? And I don't know how close I am, but Arthur was charged with cleaning up the graveyard at one point, and it would have been easy for him to drop him in a hole there and mark the cross. So just stuff like that. Anyway, so Bill gets him out, takes him to San Francisco, transcribes him for the War Department, and Arthur's diaries become submittable evidence in the 1947 and 48 international war crimes trials to put some of these guys away.
Wow. Someone else had a question, Sean?
Colin.
Yeah, she kind of partially answered the question. I was wondering, because I know that after the war, Lieutenant General Homo Masaharu was executed because of his being responsible for the Death March and the occupation. And he was executed by Firing Squadron 46. And I know they used certain testimonies from former prisoners, including General Wainwright, with regard to his war crimes trial in Tokyo. Was your grandfather's diary part of that testimony that was used?
Yes, his was used. I don't know which country or what trial, but it was in the 47, 48 trials. They absolutely used it.
That's excellent. Yeah, that was the Tokyo war crimes trial. They had 4 of the senior generals that were hanged or shot by firing squad due to treatment of prisoners. Especially, you may be aware of the Australian pig baskets.
No, not aware of that, but
well, that was pretty bad. That was right up there that was even above and beyond with what happened at Bataan. But Masaharu was found responsible for the actions of his subordinates, even though he claimed that he did not give any orders. In fact, there's evidence that he told his officers, treat them humanely, give them food when you can. But when his colonels and majors below him issued orders for execution, they were tried if they survived the war, and he was tried as commanding officer.
Right. Well, Arthur names all the main captains and different Japanese commanders in the diaries, of course. which is why it would have been horrible if they had found the diaries, because Arthur's head would have been lopped off because they were all named in there.
Colonel Don Patton, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring out one thing. I'm involved with the World War Roundtable in Minnesota, and there was a tank company from Brainerd, Minnesota, that was captured in Toto at Bataan and was part of the Death March. We had the last member of that unit just died about 2 years ago at age 102. His name was Walter Straka. But Brainerd has an April 9th event at the Armory in here in Minnesota. But I just wanted to highlight there's a book that might be of interest to people. The title of it is called Hell Ships, and in the appendix it actually has a chronological listing of the hell ships from their embarkation to their source, how many people were on, how many people were killed. But it's hell ships. I can't remember what the author, but you can Google that, and I recommend that highly for people that are interested in the fatalities and the condition of the hell ships.
Would that be Jack Morris?
Oh.
If you Google hell ships, you're going to get death on the hell ships down, hell ships. You might have several different options to choose from there.
I thought the title was just hell ships. Somewhere I've got it in my many volumes, but
I believe it's Jack Morris. I'll put the link in the chat once I get to that. Thank you, Colonel Don. Marilyn, we'll get to you in just a sec. Susan, in the chat, you said, is it possible? It is very possible he had trauma symptoms, but didn't talk about it. Even the survivors of the Holocaust frequently never talked about their experiences.
Well, sure. I mean, he died when I was 6, but I never heard my dad or anybody talk about any languishing symptoms. So I just don't know.
And Neil asked, did he ever get reimbursed for all the checks?
Oh, absolutely not. And that's the second part of the story.
I tell you that's what I want to get to, but
Yeah.
let's take our station break before.
Yeah, sure.
Because there's a twist at the end of this that is just horrific and hard to believe relative to that answering that question among a couple similar questions.
Okay, Marilyn, we'll get to your question as well. Let me go ahead and pull up my screen. We'll do our station break now. We'd just like to thank our sponsors, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. Been with us for quite some time here, and we'd like to thank them. Wait a second. Let's see here. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out everything that Tobacco-Free Adagio Health has to offer by going to their website, tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org, or calling their popular quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. We'd also like to thank UPMC for Life. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans by veterans that can save you money and get you more benefits. You can view all your plan options by going to their website, upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. Thank you so much for supporting the VBC. And we have our free quarterly magazine. Again, if you do not get this free quarterly magazine, it's because we don't have your address. If you'd like to send me your address or put it into the chat, we'll make sure that you get a copy. We'll make sure you get our future copies. This last issue is our special edition, summer edition. We labored over getting a lot of the stories we've heard here on Thursday nights into the magazine, and it's a great read cover to cover. So make sure that you get a copy if you have not. I will put a survey link into the chat. If you take 2 minutes to answer this, we watch these very closely. It lets us know how we're doing. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties tonight. Sometimes that happens. We just sort of work around it. But thank you all for being patient. Couple of programs coming up in the next couple of weeks. As Glenn said, he and Todd will be going out of town next Wednesday to go to the UK. But before then, we will have on Marine veteran Brian O'Hare talking about Gulf War. Couple of these programs coming up talking about the Gulf War. Very excited for this particular program. And then the following Monday, we will have Vietnam POW Ralph Galati. I'll be interviewing him on our Scuttlebutt Monday night. Very excited to talk with him. He is in this picture. We will ask him which person he is, as he was held in the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. We have a coup, I would call it. We have Kristen Hanna. The very popular book, The Women, is coming on in a couple weeks, September 23rd. Mark your calendar. Daria Summers will be hosting that program, but Kristen Hanna will be joining us that night to talk about her best-selling novel, The Women. And later on this month, Tony Swafford, if you've seen the movie Jarhead about the Gulf War, he was a Marine, served there. Jake Gyllenhaal played him in the movie. He lives here in Pittsburgh. Tony's going to join us to talk about it. I'm currently in the midst of his book and loving every page of it. So I'll be very excited to talk with Tony here in a few short weeks. Back to our regularly scheduled program here. Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, and as you see there, we won't have any Greatest Generation live programs for the rest of September, but we're going to make up for it in October with several excellent programs. One of them on Harry Crosby from the 100th Bomb Group and the famous Bremen mission, which is the 81st anniversary of that. October 17th, we're going to have a special screening of a documentary with our special guest, Marilyn Walton, and her compatriot, and I'm going to blank on his name. Marilyn, what is his name?
Mike Dorsey
Mike.
and Rick Martini. I think we'll both be here.
Right. This is a screening of the documentary on the POWs of Buchenwald. Right. So, and it'll be soon appearing in your inboxes. It's something we'd like you to register for. And then finally, on October 24th, we have the 80th anniversary of the Battle off Samar, as part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. We're having the grandson of Admiral Ziggy Sprague on the show, and he shared with me a lot of interesting information. And the two of us have gotten in touch with Admiral Sam Cox, who's the curator of the Navy and director of Naval History and Heritage Command. And he's going to be on that program because the Battle off Samar, if I'm pronouncing that right, maybe it's Samar, is of special interest to him. And he's written about it extensively and talked about it extensively. So there's a lot coming up in October. Just please be patient. Mm-hmm. So I think we left this off with Marilyn. You had a question, perhaps?
Not a question, a comment. I didn't know many POWs that were in the Pacific. I know how bad it was, and I know that the ones in Europe that I just knew hundreds of them, they all said the same thing. We had it really bad here, but compared to what happened to the men in the Pacific, they always had it worse than we did. I never met one that didn't say that. And my other comment, when I hear about the hell ships, the one that I did know that was on a hell ship, I'm kind of reminded every time somebody says hell ship. He was at his lowest point down deep in that ship, how hot it was, how dirty it was, how hungry they were and all that, just at his lowest moment. And when he turned around and looked at the man next to him who had an abscessed tooth at the same time, I said, I can't imagine the pain. Just a tooth is bad enough, but to be in that position, how these men made it, I have no idea. They were just incredible.
Yeah.
Well, and what is the number that we estimated?
Right. So when he was rescued from Jinsen, down from 12,000 American POWs, roughly about 350 men survived. So about 3%.
3%.
3%. So Arthur got back to San Francisco. He somehow, but even before he landed, he got flowers and a note to Julia that said, "From the boy whose only joy is loving you." And they decided to meet halfway at the Palmer House in Chicago, cut their time in half, which was their favorite hotel. So he got back to Maryland and he walked across the threshold October 25th, 1945, 4 years to the day that he left. So he took a couple of months off and then he went back to work. So he was a deputy director. He was working at Fort Meade as, I forget what, I think it was a deputy director to the chief of the Maryland Military District. And then in 1950, he became chief of the Maryland Military District during the Korean War, worked under George Brooks down there for 3.5 years. And, and then went into designing evacuation plans during the Cold War and became director of civil defense for Baltimore City and didn't retire until 1961.
But
So,
tell us about the problems he had.
Yes, so when he got back to Maryland, he realized through Julia that she was not getting the full allotment for a full colonel, his pay. She wasn't getting his full pay. So he was livid because he's writing checks and it's coming out of her check, back home, and she's not getting the full allotment from the Army. So he hit the roof pretty much. And he ended up getting the $1,500 and whatever dollars back, but then the Army decided that it was a disqualified allotment and wants it back. And he's like, no. So he has to employ lawyers who take it all the way to Washington and enact a bill in 1950. Was it 1 or 3 that says to relieve Colonel Shreve of repaying the U.S. government for this money that he was owed.
And
so he does it. He keeps the money and the bill passes and he's good, but it takes him 7 years to get the money back. And also he has to petition. See, what happened was he lost that letter in the sinking of the Uraiku Moro because it was a field upgrade to colonel. So there's no official record. So when he gets back, all the serious generals, King, Wainwright, they all write letters saying that he was a colonel. I've got all the letters because I've got his 1,200-page Army record. Anyway, he has to petition to get his rank back. I have his testimony from the Pentagon in 1953 at the Records Department. They finally reenact his full colonel rank in 53. So it took him 7 years to get his rank back.
So, Colin, I think you had put in the chat something like, I hope he got his, just rewards for everything he went through. And,
probably not so much.
And it turns out he had to fight just to get his money back, which is
I know Wainwright's story quite well because I interviewed a couple of guys who survived Cabanatuan and 2 guys who were on the Ranger Rescue mission that got him out. But it sounds like Colonel Shreve, it sounds like he did a lot more than Wainwright did, who received the Medal of Honor. If you think about it. Well,
it's funny you say that, Colin, because I've had so many people. So he did win. He received 14 medals, Legion of Merit for the fall of Bataan, Bronze Stars, whatever. But people have said to me over and over again, he really deserves the Medal of Honor. And I asked my local congressman about it. And unfortunately, there's no way to do that because there was no senior officer out in the hell ships or whatever to write down anything. There was no record of it.
Yeah, well, it's because I knew I was friends with 4 Medal of Honor recipients coming out of the Hanoi Hilton. One was my lawyer, and Stockdale and Bud Day and Leo Thorsness, and these guys, they resisted the enemy the best of their ability and helped their fellow inmates in the Hanoi Hilton, and they received the Medal of Honor. Stockdale especially because he volunteered to take beatings so people like Atterbury wouldn't be killed. And it sounds like your grandfather did a hell of a lot more than that.
Well, maybe one day posthumously he'll receive the Medal of Honor just because.
Yeah. Standing up to a bunch of Japanese officers demanding food for your men was pretty ballsy, I got to tell you.
Well, he didn't demand food. He just made sure that it went on record that their treatment sucked and that every single violation, he wanted it recorded for history purposes. That he went and recorded it. That was it. But you're right, it was ballsy. He was playing a cat and mouse game with the Japanese because, like you said, at any moment, they could have lopped his head off.
Well, the only reason they didn't kill him, I would assume, and I interviewed some Japanese veterans too, is because they respected him.
Well, that's exactly right. I forgot to tell you how he got the parts for the canteen, though. Do we have time for that?
Sure.
Okay. So he had this genius plan, and it's in the diaries, but I have extra material. I figured out how this happened from another book written about the time. Anyway, he told the POWs in the power plant in Cabanatuan that at 11 p.m. one night to ramp up the generators so it would blow out the Japanese radios, which it did. And of course, Colonel Shreve knows a lot about radios, and he knew that they would come to him for help. So the next morning, the Japanese come to him and say, you know, our radios have been blown out. Could you come help us fix our radios, right? So Arthur goes in there to the radio room and he asks for 2 of every single part, and pockets, when they get the parts to him, he pockets the old parts and uses them for his canteen. So his genius plan to ask for 2 of everything worked.
There's a couple. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, I just wanted to come back to Richard. Is it Richard Kensinger? Richard? Are you from the Pittsburgh area, Richard?
I asked you to unmute, Richard. Go ahead.
I'm good?
Yep.
Okay. I live in Altoona.
Altoona.
Altoona. So I'm close by.
I've had a lot of friends.
I'm fairly new to this talking about veterans. I've done treatment with veterans from Korea, Vietnam, but not the Middle East. But I do a lot of clinical research. It's just my reaction as a therapist. They're in hell. Most of them I've talked to, they're in hell, and they think they'll never get to heaven. They have profound moral injuries. That's oftentimes not. Oh, shoot, we can diagnose PTSD, addiction, but we miss the profound moral injury. So I hope to offer a little bit more of my research as time goes on.
Well,
I don't mean any disrespect, Heather, to anybody who goes through that ordeal.
Well, I just don't have any evidence one way or the other, because nobody ever said to me,
Sure.
You know, he had this breakdown over here, or he had this happen over here. I never heard that. I never heard that.
I got you.
Yeah.
You know, my own family experience with PTSD with 2 brothers who were in Nam is, you know, unless you live with these people, it's very possible you don't see it.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
You know, I have a story as a kid I've told about my brother John. I was 13 or 14. He came back from Nam on leave, lived in a little house with us, and he woke up in the middle of the night one night, you know, yelling grenade.
Yep.
And just scared to death out of this 13-year-old, 12-year-old brother, you know. And it's the kind of thing that, you know, I would have never and I didn't understand it at the time, obviously. I was too young to.
Right.
I do recommend the book at some point if you want to read it. It's Shooting Ghosts by Thomas Brenneman, who was a Marine, and Finbar O'Reilly, Irish, who was a photographer embedded with this outpost unit of Marines. That it is raw. They're very honest about their experience.
Richard, let me ask you, do we have are you an actual member of the Veterans Breakfast Club? Do we have your email address?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Somewhere it is, yeah, because I've emailed some of my work, some of my clinical research to y'all, to Todd usually.
To Todd, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's just the first time I've noticed you on our program, but.
Well, I was Paula.
Yeah.
The first time
I see
was
Paula up there. Yeah.
Paula needs a haircut.
I need to dye my hair. Yeah, well, although I'm used to the gray. We have premature graying in our family.
Someone else made a comment I want to come back to. I'm not sure who it was, about Asian cultures and their treatment of prisoners versus Western cultures, let's say, right? And next week, Sean, you have someone on that was a POW in Hanoi.
2 weeks. We have joining us. And yes, he was a POW at Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War.
And we all know the stories coming out of there, which are very similar to the stories coming out of the Japanese with the Philippines in World War II. But Maryland, very different than the stories coming out of Germany, where there was certainly, discomfort, certainly hard times, certainly lack of food, certainly so many privations, but very little in the way of beatings or abuse or anything like that.
There were some in the enlisted men's camp, especially Stalag 4, where they had a particularly evil guard there, huge man, and they called him Big Stoop. And I think Don Miller mentions him in his book. He might. And he had huge hands, and he'd just come up and slap them real hard on their ears, and he'd break their eardrums. And by the time those prisoners got to Stalag 7A down in Mooseburg, they finally found him dead. Somebody had actually beheaded him at Mooseburg.
Wow.
He had a lot of enemies, and even the officers at Stalag 3 had heard of him, even though they weren't in the enlisted men's camp. So he had quite a reputation, just as sadistic as he could be. And I think the fact that, the Geneva Convention made a huge difference in how the prisoners were treated between Germany, where the camps I'm aware of, and of course in the Pacific, when they didn't really abide by too many of those things, they did things differently.
Not at all.
Right?
Some sort of underlying cultural point to be made here.
As far as I know, the Japanese, because they're so good at understanding the human body, they really know how to torture really well. But it also has to do with the spirit of the samurai. They feel like if you're a prisoner, you're lower than life, and that if the roles were reversed, they would choose death. So they have no respect for any kind of prisoner type situation.
That's right. Yeah. As much as I watched the movie The Great Escape, the other one I watched and just loved was The Bridge on the River Kwai.
Oh yeah.
That one, it showed a difference in that kind of mentality, how the guards were. I noted that between Germany and a whole different, I think there was a big cultural difference there, a big divide.
Oh,
and
you reminded me of something. You reminded me of something, Martha. This is another anecdotal story, but somewhere around September 44, the last 78 prisoners from the bridge over the River Kwai, the last 78 of 48,000 drift into Cabanatuan, and Arthur gets food. Somebody asked him if he could get some toothbrushes and T-shirts and supplies. Well, the next morning he wakes up, he's got so much stuff that's been donated from the prisoners in Cabanatuan, he can't even get out of his barrack.
Oh, wow. It's quite a
They
story.
just piled it up at his door.
We're going to go to Bob Flage in just a sec, but yes, Colin, in the chat, the film Farewell to the King and Unbroken. I highly recommend the book Unbroken. And I know that there's a sequel to that as well that deals more after World War II, but I read Unbroken years ago and was blown away by it. Bob Flage?
Yes, sir. I haven't studied much about the POWs in Europe, but what I've read and seen on these memoirs on YouTube, the female guards were much more brutal in the prison camps to the females in Europe than they took great joy in just slapping people and having attack dogs on them.
The concentration camps in particular, a lot of those women were tried, and many were hanged after the war, particularly sadistic.
Absolutely, yeah. But I didn't, in looking at these YouTubes, I didn't see that much that the men were doing. Maybe the compos that they had, from the prisoners themselves were, abusive. But like I said, what I've seen is the females were much more abusive to the female populations.
Yeah, it's really sad.
Well, Glenn, can I just tell the very last piece of the story?
Please, let's finish.
Yeah, real quick. So in 1968, when he came back from the Philippines, they gave him a dose of antibiotics to try to get rid of any schistosomiasis or any lingering parasites. But in late 68, they found schistosomiasis in his kidneys, and they sent him down to, oh God, what's the hospital here? The Army hospital.
Walter Reed?
Yes, thank you, Walter Reed. And they operated on him in early 69, and unfortunately, it had turned into kidney cancer, and they really couldn't do anything for him, and so he died March 12th, 1969, and his funeral was on the 17th, which is around Maryland Day, and the church he was buried at here in Howard County, they lowered the flag for the first time since the Civil War, and there were 600 people at his funeral.
Wow.
Oh, I have to read you. Yeah, I have to read you something. No, hold on one second. This is very, very touching. So, one of the main radio stations here called WBAL Radio, they interrupted the program that day, March 17th, 1969. It says, "I'm constrained to end the first edition of the new program, Critic at Large, on a note of loss over the passing of an old and very fine friend, Arthur Shreve, former head of the military district here, director of civil defense, and a member of the infamous Death March in the Philippines, died last week. In his passing," hold on, I was just running over there. "In his passing, all that has been noble and good in the American professional soldier, as his life was dedicated to the Army and the service of his country. He was a good and excellent man. May he rest in peace."
God bless him.
That's really nice.
Yeah,
Yes.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah.
that's the end of the story.
Well, as Colin said, in reading the book, listening to the story through your voice, Heather, he ranks right up there with those men who win the Medal of Honor out of the Hanoi Hilton. I mean,
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
from, you know. Okay, well, listen, unless there's any other questions, I think we've kind of reached almost the witching hour. Sean, anything else we should address?
But maybe one last is Greg Yost put into the chat. Let's see here. Since he lived long enough to see the U.S.-Japanese reconciliation during the Cold War, economically, politically, etc., well, what did he think of that? Did he harbor any long-lasting animosity towards the Japanese into the 50s and 60s?
You know what? That's an excellent question. He died when I was 6. I never heard any nasty things coming out of his mouth, and I never heard my dad or my grandmother, who lived to 1987. I never heard anything like, "We hate the Japanese." You know, I think my grandfather knew enough that you take people on an individual basis. You know, it's not all Japanese. It was those Japanese, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that, but my guess is, to make his life easier, he was the kind of guy that would have let that go.
What is amazing, and Richard, you could comment on this if you're familiar with the stories. Unbroken, the book and the movie, right?
Yep.
That man, incredibly mistreated, and yet he goes back and finds his tormentor in Japan, and I think, if I recall correctly, forgives him.
You do.
There's another great book and a movie.
Yep.
I think it's called The Train or The Trains. It's a UK movie about a British man who was captured at the fall of Singapore, and he goes through hell as well, and had a tormentor, and he goes back and finds that man and forgives him. And
One of the Doolittle Raiders did that as well.
Yes. And
Yeah.
some of the people that fought in Vietnam have done that as well to reconcile with these folks.
Yeah.
Yep.
give me a clue. How mentally, what are these men? I mean, is that some sort of closure they're looking for? What I mean,
It is some level of coming to terms after they go through the hell. When they leave the combat zone, they can't carry around that rage and that resentment and that revenge. So that's what they find. Now, Rocky Bleier, if you know who Rocky Bleier is, went back to Vietnam. It was very, very emotional. I don't think he ever got to the point where he could forgive what happened during that conflict.
Yeah.
But it helped him with some closure.
Right.
Yep.
So Senator McCain has weighed in, John McCain weighed in on my grandfather in 2017, saying that his story really should go down in history for everyone to enjoy.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Good story.
It's a great story of incredible courage, an incredible man who just went through such intense suffering with such, I don't know how to describe it, such
Grace and style.
almost with such great nobility, you know.
Yeah, nobility.
I don't mean
Yeah,
that.
that's a good word. Well, like they said in this thing, everything great, noble and great in the American soldier.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well put.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. This has been fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for everybody for being on board tonight. And please tune in for the coming weeks.
We will.
Yep,
I
thanks.
will.
Bye.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you all. Have
Good
a
night.
wonderful evening.
Ciao.